Tonight, we begin in a city that never expected silence. Long before stone pyramids cast shadows across the Nile, the low plains between the Tigris and Euphrates were already crowded with movement. Water channels cut through fields. Donkeys moved between storehouses. Clay tablets passed from hand to hand, still damp from inscription. The cities of southern Mesopotamia were not quiet places. They were administrative landscapes, built around flow of grain, of labor, of records, and rising above that movement stood something deliberately still. From the ground, it appeared open, visible, central. Its terraces faced the city without concealment. Nothing about its exterior suggested secrecy, and yet, for most of the people who lived their entire lives beneath its shadow, it remained unreachable. Not symbolically, physically, the tablets do not describe crowds ascending its stairways. They do not record festivals held at its summit. They do not list ordinary citizens entering its upper levels. Instead, the language that appears again and again is administrative, restrained, and selective. Access was limited. This is not immediately obvious if one approaches the ziggurat through later assumptions. Much of what we think we know comes from analogy from temples in other cultures, from later religious traditions, from expectations about sacred space. But the earliest Sumerian records do not explain the ziggurat as a place meant for gathering. They describe it as a controlled structure. One early administrative tablet from the Uruk period lists allocations of labor assigned to the ziggurat precinct. The text is not concerned with belief. It records measurements, rations, and responsibilities. Certain individuals are named, others are absent. What matters is not who worshipped, but who was authorized. This distinction matters. In Sumerian records, authorization is never casual. Roles are assigned. Duties are inherited. Knowledge is distributed unevenly. The language of the tablets treats access as something granted through position, not devotion. When priests appear in these texts, they are not described as self. They are custodians. Their tasks involve oversight, preservation, and correct procedure. They are responsible for maintaining continuity, not enthusiasm. The words used for their roles align more closely with administration than with ceremony, and they are the ones permitted to enter. The architecture reinforces this separation. Excavations around major ziggurats reveal controlled approaches rather than open plazas. Walls define movement. Stairways narrow as they rise. In some cases, access routes are offset or angled, limiting visibility and slowing ascent. These are not neutral design choices. If the intention had been to accommodate crowds, the structures could have been broader, flatter, more accessible. Instead, the built environment favors regulation, one person at a time, one ascent at a time, movement that can be observed and, if necessary, denied. At the upper levels, the evidence becomes even more restrained. There is little indication of space designed for large ritual gatherings. No wide platforms. No architectural features meant to hold assemblies. Instead, there are enclosed rooms, small chambers, and restricted zones. The higher one goes, the less public the structure becomes. This introduces a quiet problem. If the ziggurat was primarily a temple in the modern sense, a place for communal worship, why does so little of its design support communal presence? Why do the records emphasize management rather than participation? The tablets are careful in what they describe, but they are equally revealing in what they omit. There is no language celebrating mass devotion at the summit, no descriptions of crowds ascending in reverence. What is recorded instead are deliveries, inventories, and procedures carried out by specific individuals. The ziggurat, in these texts, functions less as a gathering point and more as a boundary. It stands at the center of the city, yet remains separate from it. Everyone can see it, few can approach it, fewer still can enter it. Kings themselves occupy an ambiguous position in this arrangement. Royal inscriptions proudly record the construction and restoration of ziggurats. Rulers emphasize their role in maintaining these structures, repairing foundations, renewing terraces, and dedicating materials. Yet even kings do not consistently appear as figures. Moving freely within the upper levels, authority builds the structure, another authority governs what happens. Inside, this separation suggests that the power embodied by the ziggurat is not purely political, nor purely religious. It operates on a different register, one that requires training, restriction, and procedural knowledge. In Sumerian thought, certain forms of knowledge are treated as unstable if widely distributed. Names, measurements, calendrical calculations, and ritual procedures are preserved through controlled transmission. The priest is not simply a mediator between humans and gods. He is a caretaker of inherited systems. If this is the case, then the restriction surrounding the ziggurat begins to make sense. What was being protected may not have been a god in residence, but a process, a record, a system whose continuity mattered more than public access. Elevation, in this context, would not signify closeness to the divine alone, but separation from disruption. The higher levels were quieter, more controlled, less exposed to the city's noise. This may explain why entry was limited, not by belief, but by role. If the ziggurat functioned as a mechanism rather than a monument, then its silence is intentional. Its restriction is structural, and its purpose lies not in what it displayed, but in what it contained. But if that is so, then another question follows naturally. If priests alone were permitted to enter these elevated spaces, what exactly required such careful protection from the rest of the city? The restriction becomes easier to understand when we stop looking upward and begin looking outward. Around the base of the ziggurat, the ground tells a quieter story than the summit ever could. Excavations across southern Mesopotamia consistently reveal that these raised structures were not isolated monuments. They were embedded within dense networks of buildings, whose functions were unmistakably administrative. Storehouses, workshops, archives, courtyards, designed for processing, not gathering. The ziggurat did not stand alone. It stood at the center of a managed zone. Archaeologists have long noted that the areas immediately surrounding major ziggurats show unusually controlled circulation patterns. Walls channel movement along specific routes. Entrances are few and clearly defined. Open spaces are functional rather than ceremonial, often associated with loading, storage, or supervision rather than assembly. This is not accidental. In cities like Uruk and Ur, excavation layers reveal repeated rebuilding of access points while maintaining the same restrictive layout. Even as cities expanded and populations increased, the spatial logic around the ziggurat remained conservative. Movement toward the structure was regulated. Proximity did not imply permission. The architecture itself enforces hierarchy. As one approaches a ziggurat, the ground rises gradually, often through successive terraces or platforms that narrow as they ascend. Each level represents not merely elevation, but exclusion. The design slows movement, limits numbers, and creates points of oversight. Anyone ascending would have been visible, their progress observable from multiple angles. This kind of visibility is administrative, not devotional. If the goal were awe or spectacle, a broad, uninterrupted ascent would have served better. Instead, the Ziggurats stairways often turn, interrupt sightlines, and break momentum. The experience of ascent is measured, controlled, deliberate at the base. Access is wide. Higher up, access narrows at the top. Access nearly disappears. What lies above is not meant to be reached casually. Surrounding buildings reinforce this interpretation. Many of the structures adjacent to Ziggurats contain large numbers of seal impressions, storage jars, and accounting tablets. These are not the artifacts of mass ritual. They are the tools of management. Seals in particular matter here. Cylinder seals were not decorative objects. They were instruments of authorization. To roll a seal onto clay was to assert identity, responsibility, and legitimacy. The concentration of sealings near Ziggurats suggests that these elevated spaces were integrated into systems of verification and control. Goods moved inward. Records moved upward. Authority moved vertically in this context. Elevation takes on a practical meaning. Higher spaces were not simply closer to the sky. They were further from interference. Noise diminished with height. Foot traffic decreased. Environmental disruption was reduced. What remained was stability. This matters in a city where almost everything depended on regulation. Sumerian cities were fragile systems. Water had to be managed precisely. Grain had to be stored correctly. Labor had to be allocated carefully. A failure in any of these areas could threaten survival. The administrative apparatus was not abstract, was existential, placing critical functions within elevated, restricted zones made sense. It reduced risk. It limited access. It preserved continuity. The ziggurat, viewed this way, becomes less a stage and more a platform. A controlled environment elevated above the unpredictability of the city. A place where procedures could be carried out without interruption. Even the materials used support this reading. The lower levels of ziggurats were often constructed with mud brick, reinforced by bitumen, while upper levels sometimes incorporated baked brick. The investment increases with height. Durability improves. The most protected spaces are also the most carefully built. Protection is cumulative. The city below was dynamic, noisy, and exposed to seasonal disruption. Floods, markets, disputes, and daily labor defined its rhythm. The ziggurat rose above that rhythm, not symbolically, but functionally. It was removed enough to remain stable. This separation also explains why surrounding administrative buildings cluster near the base rather than the summit. The lower precincts handle flow of goods, people, and information. The upper structure handles preservation. Nothing in the archaeological record suggests that large numbers of people needed to be present above instead. Everything suggests that large numbers needed to be kept out. When later cultures looked back at these structures, it was easy to assume they were temples in the familiar sense. Elevated spaces often become sacred by association. But the earliest material evidence does not prioritize ritual visibility. It prioritizes control. If the ziggurat was a managed space, then its height was not merely symbolic. it was logistical. This raises another quiet implication. If architecture was used to regulate movement and preserve order, then the people allowed to move within it were not chosen for their faith alone. They were chosen for their function, which brings us back to the priests. If elevation served management rather than worship, then the role of the priest must be reconsidered not as a performer of public ritual, but as an operator within a restricted system. And if that is true, what exactly were they managing once they crossed those final thresholds? By the time a priest reached the upper levels of the ziggurat, the city below had already fallen away. The noise diminished first. The sounds of labor, animals, and exchange softened with height. What remained was stillness, not emptiness, but controlled quiet. This was not accidental. It was cultivated in Sumerian texts. The priest is rarely described in emotional or spiritual terms. He is not portrayed as a visionary or a mystic. Instead, the language used to define his role is procedural. He maintains. He measures. He ensures correctness. His authority does not come from personal charisma or divine inspiration, but from training and appointment. This distinction is subtle but critical. Administrative tablets from temple precincts list priests alongside scribes and overseers. They receive rations. They are assigned duties. Their names appear in records of labor distribution and inventory control. They are part of an institutional structure, not an ecstatic one. When priests are associated with the ziggurat, they are not singled out as worshippers. They are identified as functionaries within a system that requires restricted access. The Sumerian vocabulary reinforces this reading. Terms used for priestly roles often overlap with terms of stewardship and guardianship. The emphasis is not on prayer, but on correct handling. Errors matter. Procedures must be followed precisely. Deviations carry consequences. This suggests that whatever occurred within the ziggurat required consistency more than enthusiasm. Kings, by contrast, occupy a different position. Royal inscriptions proudly declare the construction or restoration of ziggurats. Kings describe laying foundations, raising terraces, and dedicating materials. These acts are framed as obligations, duties, owed to the gods and to tradition. But once the structure is complete, the king steps back. There is a notable absence in the records. Kings do not describe themselves as frequent occupants of the upper levels. Their authority legitimizes the structure. It does not govern its internal operations. That responsibility belongs elsewhere. This division of roles is not unique to architecture. It reflects a broader Sumerian understanding of power. Kingship is public, visible, proclaimed, priestly. Authority is internal, procedural, quiet. One establishes order, the other preserves it. The ziggurat sits precisely at the intersection of these two domains. Built by kings, operated by priests, the restriction of access, then, is not a matter of sanctity alone. It is a matter of jurisdiction. Inside the ziggurat, authority shifts. The rules governing the city no longer apply in the same way. What matters is correctness of measurement, of timing, of record. This becomes clearer when we examine foundation inscriptions. These texts, buried within the structure itself, do not describe rituals or prayers. They list materials, dimensions, and labor contributions. They name officials responsible for specific tasks. The language is technical, almost dry, even in texts meant for divine attention. The emphasis remains procedural. This suggests that the ziggurat was understood as part of an inherited system, something maintained across generations, independent of individual rulers or changing political conditions. Priests, trained to preserve continuity, were its natural custodians. If access were open, continuity would be fragile too. Many hands to many interpretations, too much noise, restriction becomes a form of protection. This also explains why priestly roles were often hereditary or institutionally bound. Knowledge was transmitted within controlled lineages or schools. Scribes trained for years to master scripts and conventions. Priests learned procedures that could not be improvised. The ziggurat was not a place for innovation. It was a place for preservation, and preservation requires boundaries. If priests entered the ziggurat not to worship, but to operate inherited systems, then what they encountered there was not spectacle, but responsibility. The upper levels were not elevated to impress. They were elevated to isolate. This raises a further question. If priests managed systems rather than ceremonies within the ziggurat, what exactly were those systems centered on? And where, within this layered structure, did the written record fit into that arrangement? What the priest carried upward was rarely visible from the ground. It was not incense, not offerings, not objects meant to be seen. It was information across Mesopotamia. Some of the densest concentrations of administrative tablets have been found not in public squares, but in controlled precincts near elevated structures. These tablets are unremarkable at first glance, small, rectangular, pressed with rows of signs that record quantities, dates, names, and obligations. They do not tell stories. They account for them. What matters is where they were kept. Excavations at sites such as Uruk, Ur, and Lagash show that tablets associated with redistribution, labor assignment, and long-term accounting were often stored in rooms with restricted access. In several cases, these rooms are located adjacent to or within elevated architectural complexes connected to ziggurats. The placement is deliberate. Clay tablets are fragile. They can be broken, erased, or altered while still damp. Even once fired, they remain vulnerable to moisture, impact, and human interference. Preserving them requires stability, environmental and social. Elevation provides. Both. Higher ground is less exposed to flooding. Reduced foot traffic means fewer accidents and fewer opportunities for tampering. Access control limits who can see, handle, or modify records. In a society where written documentation underpinned authority, this mattered. The tablets themselves reflect this concern. Many are sealed. Cylinder seals are rolled across clay not to decorate, but to authenticate. A seal transforms a tablet from information into obligation. It fixes responsibility. Once sealed, a record cannot be altered without detection. But a seal only works if access is controlled. Archives, then, are not passive storage spaces. They are active instruments of governance. Whoever controls them controls memory of debts, of labor owed, of goods distributed. In this sense, record keeping is not secondary to power. It is foundational. The ziggurat's elevation may have served this purpose, quietly, by placing archives within or near restricted elevated zones. Sumerian administrators ensured that records remained intact across seasons and reigns. Tablets could outlast kings. They could preserve obligations. Long after the people involved were gone, this transforms our understanding of sacred space. If the upper levels of the ziggurat housed records directly or indirectly, then elevation was not about proximity to gods alone. It was about proximity to permanence. The written word, once fixed, carried authority independent of any individual. Priests and scribes, trained in both ritual and record, became custodians of this permanence. Their access was not symbolic, it was practical. Linguistic evidence supports this reading. The Sumerian terms for writing and record keeping emphasize fixing, setting, and establishing. To write was to stabilize. To record was to make durable. These actions align more closely with preservation than with performance. The archives were not meant to be seen by all. They were meant to endure. This may explain why so few tablets speak directly about the internal function of ziggurats. Records rarely describe themselves. They operate quietly, shaping outcomes without spectacle. When goods moved through the city, grain redistributed, labor assigned. Rations issued, the authority behind those movements often traced back to records stored elsewhere. Somewhere elevated, somewhere restricted. The priest's role, in this context, becomes clearer. He is not merely a mediator between humans and gods. He is a mediator between present action and recorded obligation, between the city's movement and its memory. If archives were elevated, then knowledge itself was stratified. The city lived at ground level, records lived above it. Access narrowed as one ascended. This arrangement reinforces the idea that civilization, in Sumerian thought, was inherited rather than invented anew each generation. Systems were preserved, not reinvented. Deviations risked disorder. Elevation helped enforce continuity. And yet, this raises another tension. If records governed redistribution, labor, and authority, and if those records were stored in restricted, elevated spaces, then who ultimately controlled them? Priests maintained them, scribes produced them, kings authorized them. But authorization is not the same as access. If kings built the ziggurats but did not manage the archives within, then political power and administrative power were not identical. One depended on the other, but neither fully absorbed it. This separation suggests a complex balance. The ziggurat was not simply a religious monument. It was an infrastructural node in a system that bound architecture, administration, and memory together. Elevation protected not only objects, but continuity itself. If that is true, then the ziggurat functioned as a stabilizing mechanism within the city, a place where records outlasted events, and procedures outlasted rulers. But if stability depended on fixed records and controlled access, then another question becomes unavoidable. What happened when numbers, calendars, calculations centered this elevated system? And how did precision itself shape who was allowed inside? Precision enters the story quietly, not as philosophy, not as belief, but as necessity. By the time Sumerian cities reached administrative maturity, nothing moved without measurement. Grain was counted, labor was quantified, time itself was divided, tracked, and regulated. These were not abstract practices. They were embedded into daily survival, and precision changes who is allowed to participate. Sumerian mathematics was not speculative. It was operational. The sexagesimal system, based on units of 60, was not chosen for elegance, but for divisibility. It allowed administrators to break quantities into predictable fractions. This mattered when allocating rations, assigning workdays, or timing irrigation cycles. Errors were not philosophical mistakes, they were failures of governance. Metrological tablets show standardized units for volume, weight, and area. These standards were not suggestions. They were enforced conventions. A field measured incorrectly affected yields. A ration miscalculated disrupted labor. A calendar misaligned with seasons threatened harvest. Precision was not optional. Where was this precision maintained? Not in the marketplace, not in the fields, but within controlled, institutional spaces. Several tablets record the calibration of weights and measures. These texts do not circulate widely. They appear in administrative contexts tied to temple complexes. Their purpose is to define correctness, to establish reference points against which all other measurements are judged. Such reference systems cannot be public in the ordinary sense. They must be protected from alteration, debate, or improvisation. A standard only functions if it remains stable. Elevation assists with that, by placing metrological control within restricted spaces. Sumerian administrators insulated the system from daily fluctuation. The city below could adapt. The standards above could not. Stability was enforced through separation. Calendrical knowledge follows the same pattern. Astronomical observation in Mesopotamia was not undertaken for curiosity alone. It governed ritual timing, agricultural cycles, and administrative schedules. Months were named, festivals fixed, labor obligations synchronized with seasonal changes. The calendar regulated. Everything but the calendar itself was not self-evident. It required observation, adjustment, and correction. Lunar cycles drift. Intercalary months must be added. Without oversight, the system collapses. This oversight did not belong to the crowd. Texts referring to timekeeping and celestial observation are sparse and technical. They do not explain themselves. They assume training. They assume restricted readership. The individuals responsible for maintaining temporal order were specialists, and specialists require controlled environments. If observation points existed atop or near ziggurats, some architectural alignments suggest this possibility then. Elevation again serves a functional purpose. Height improves visibility. It removes obstructions. It reduces interference. But more importantly, it restricts participation. Only those trained to interpret what they saw were permitted to observe. Only those authorized could adjust the calendar. Only those entrusted with precision could alter the rhythm of the city. This concentration of numerical authority reinforces earlier patterns. The priest is no longer merely a custodian of ritual or record. He becomes a regulator of time and quantity. His authority rests not on revelation, but on correctness. Kings depend on this authority. Royal inscriptions often emphasize harmony with proper timing. Kings boast of restoring festivals at their correct dates, of aligning their reigns with established order, but they do not define that order themselves. They rely on inherited systems. This creates a subtle dependency. Political power requires legitimacy. Legitimacy requires correct timing. Correct timing requires specialized knowledge. That knowledge resides elsewhere if the zig housed or symbolized the locus of precision, where standards were kept, calendars maintained, and measurements stabilized, then restricting access becomes unavoidable. Too many observers introduce inconsistency. Too many hands invite error. Elevation enforces discipline. This also reframes the absence of spectacle. Precision does not need witnesses. It needs accuracy. A calendar adjusted incorrectly affects everyone, regardless of whether they saw the adjustment occur. Authority here is invisible, but absolute. The ziggurat, viewed through this lens, becomes a vertical regulator, a structure that separates mutable daily life from fixed systemic order. The city flows. The standards remain. If that is so, then the priest's ascent is not symbolic. It is procedural. He moves upward to consult fixed points that govern the rest of society. And if precision governs distribution, labor, and time itself, then it also governs responsibility, which leads to another question. If law and obligation were structured with the same layered logic as measurement and time, did the ziggurat also reflect how order itself, social, legal, even bodily, was conceived and enforced? Order, in Sumerian thought, was never flat. It was layered. The same logic that organized space, records, and numbers also shaped how responsibility and the body itself were understood. Law and medicine, though distinct in function, share a common structure in the surviving texts. Both operate through gradation, both depend on classification, and both assume that imbalance, once introduced, must be corrected through precise intervention. This is not coincidence. Legal tablets from the early dynastic period rarely read like moral arguments. They do not persuade. They assign. Injuries are listed alongside compensations. Actions are paired with consequences. The language is conditional, almost mechanical. If this occurs, then that follows. What matters is not intention, but outcome. Not belief, but effect. The body is treated in similar terms in diagnostic texts. Illness is described as displacement, intrusion, or imbalance. Symptoms are catalogued. Causes are inferred. Treatments follow established sequences. The practitioner's task is not to interpret meaning, but to restore order in both law and medicine. The goal is stability. This approach mirrors the architecture we have been examining. Just as the city is layered vertically, so too are systems of accountability. Certain actions are handled publicly, others are escalated. The most consequential determinations are removed from everyday circulation and placed within controlled contexts. Authority ascends as complexity increases. Legal authority, like administrative authority, depends on precedent. Tablets record cases not to tell stories, but to fix outcomes. Once recorded, a decision becomes part of the inherited system. Future actions are measured against it. This is memory made operational. The priest, in this framework, occupies a role that bridges domains. He is trained not only in ritual, but in procedure. He understands how categories are maintained, how deviations are addressed, how balance is restored. His authority does not derive from charisma, but from alignment with established order. The ziggurat's form reflects this. Worldview, its stepped structure, resembles the logic of escalation found in legal and medical texts. Minor issues are resolved at lower levels. More complex disturbances move upward, toward spaces where fewer individuals are permitted to intervene. Each level filters access. Each ascent narrows authority. Each step removes noise. The body, the city, and the law are treated as systems requiring maintenance. Disorder is not condemned. It is corrected. But correction must occur within the proper framework. That framework is not public. Medical texts, sometimes refer to treatments that are not to be performed openly. Certain procedures require preparation, isolation, and exact timing. The practitioner must follow inherited formulas. Innovation is dangerous. Deviation risks worsening the condition. Here again, restriction protects function. If law and medicine are governed by layered logic, then the Ziggurats' elevation is not symbolic abstraction. It is architectural expression, a visible form encoding an invisible system. This also clarifies why access was restricted even among elites. Kings might command armies and adjudicate disputes, but they do not rewrite foundational procedures. Their authority operates within boundaries established elsewhere. The priest's ascent is therefore not a privilege. It is a burden. To enter elevated space is to assume responsibility for maintaining balance across the entire system. Errors propagate downward. A misjudgment at the top affects everything below. This may explain the restrained tone of many Sumerian texts. There is little celebration of discipline. There is caution, awareness of consequence, an understanding that order, once disturbed, is difficult to restore. The ziggurat embodies this restraint. It rises above the city not to dominate it, but to distance itself from instability. Its height creates separation, not superiority. What happens within it must be insulated from impulse. If law, medicine, and administration share this structural logic, then the ziggurat is not merely a place where systems converge. It is the spatial representation of system itself. Structure built to reflect how order is maintained, rather than how belief is expressed. But this raises another question. If even divine narratives were shaped by the same language of function and allocation, how did myth itself describe elevated space? And what role did beings like the Anunnaki occupy within that layered order? When myth enters the record, it does so cautiously. The language shifts, but the structure remains. In Sumerian mythological texts, elevated spaces appear often, yet rarely as places of devotion in the modern sense. They are described instead as sites of decision, allocation, and decree. What happens there affects the world below, not through spectacle, but through outcome. This is especially evident in texts involving the Anunnaki. When the Anunnaki are named, they are not introduced as beings who demand worship. They are not portrayed as recipients of offerings or leaders of ritual assemblies. Their role is administrative in character. They deliberate. They assign. They determine fate. They sit. The verb matters. In several compositions, the Anunnaki are described as seated in assembly, not moving, not descending, not intervening directly. Their authority is exercised through presence and judgment rather than action. They are stationary figures within a structured order. This mirrors the function of elevated space. In the myth of Inanna's descent, the Anunnaki appear as judges in the underworld. They do not argue. They do not persuade. They look, and their gaze fixes outcome. Decision is immediate and irreversible. Power here is procedural, not emotional. The setting is enclosed, restricted. Access is controlled by gates. At each threshold, something is removed. Authority increases as movement narrows. By the time Inanna reaches the final chamber, she is stripped of all symbols of power. This is not theater, it is structure. The underworld in Sumerian thought is not chaotic. It is ordered, regulated, and governed by rule. The Anunnaki enforce that rule. Their authority lies in maintaining balance between realms, not in inspiring devotion. Elevated spaces in myth function similarly. In texts describing divine councils, decisions about humanity, kingship, or catastrophe are not made in public. They occur in closed assemblies. The language emphasizes deliberation, decree, and distribution. Outcomes descend. Processes do not. This pattern suggests that elevation, whether above the city or beneath it, marks zones of governance rather than worship. The ziggurat, in this light, aligns more closely with the mythic council chamber than with a temple courtyard. It is a place where decisions affecting the many are made by the few, where access is limited not because the space is sacred, but because the function requires insulation. That the Anunnaki themselves embody this principle. They are not creators, they are not performers, they are a DJU, DICATOR. Their authority is exercised collectively, not individually. They represent continuity rather than initiative. Their decisions fix fate, allocating roles and outcomes within an inherited order. This resonates with the priestly function. We have traced, the priest does not invent, he preserves. He applies what already exists in myth. When order is disrupted by overpopulation, noise, or imbalance, the response is not improvisation. It is recalibration. Decisions are made in assembly. Measures are imposed. Boundaries are redrawn. Even catastrophe follows procedure. The flood narratives describe deliberation before destruction. Warnings are constrained by rules. Solutions are indirect. Nothing happens impulsively. The system corrects itself through controlled intervention. If myth reflects how the Sumerians understood order, then the Ziggurats' restriction makes sense within that worldview. Elevated space is where decisions are stabilized before being released. Downward. Not everyone can enter such a space. Not everyone should. This does not mean the ziggurat was mythic in function. It means myth and architecture share the same logic. Both encode separation, deliberation, and controlled transmission. The city acts. The elevated space decides. If priests alone were permitted to enter, it was because their role aligned with this logic. They were trained to maintain inherited order, not to express personal belief. The Anunnaki, seated and silent, reflect the same principle at a cosmic scale, which leaves one final question. If elevation served governance, preservation, and correction across myth, law, and administration, what happened to these structures when the system itself was disrupted by flood, collapse, or memory loss, and how were their functions remembered afterward? When collapse comes, it rarely announces itself as an ending in Mesopotamia. It arrived as water. Archaeological layers across the southern plains preserve this moment quietly. Bands of silt interrupt occupation levels. Floors disappear beneath fine sediment. Walls dissolve into mud. In cities like Shuruppak, Kish, and Ur, the material record shows abrupt breaks, periods where normal activity ceased and rebuilding began again on altered ground. These are not myths in clay. They are deposits. Floods were not abstract disasters for the Sumerians. They were recurring threats that could erase fields, drown archives, and displace populations in a matter of days. When they occurred at a sufficient scale, they did more than destroy buildings. They disrupted systems, and systems, once broken, must be reassembled. The ziggurat occupies a peculiar position in this process. Unlike houses or workshops, these raised structures were often repaired, rebuilt, or reoccupied even after surrounding areas changed. Their foundations were renewed. their terraces reconstructed. Sometimes their form was altered, but their presence endured. This persistence suggests that whatever function they served was not easily abandoned. In post-flood, rebuilding inscriptions, kings emphasize restoration rather than innovation. They speak of returning structures to their proper state, of re-establishing order, of repairing what had been damaged, not replacing it with something new. The language is conservative. Memory matters more than novelty. This is consistent with the broader Sumerian approach to civilization. Writing, law, measurement, and ritual were all understood as inherited. They came from an earlier time, often described as more complete, more ordered. The task of the present was not to invent, but to preserve. Ziggurats fit this pattern. After disruption, their function may have shifted subtly. Archives moved. Administrative practices adapted. But the logic of elevation and restriction remained. The rebuilt structures still limited access, still rose above the city, still marked a separation between daily life and inherited order. Over time, however, meaning began to drift. Later texts, composed centuries after the earliest ziggurats were built, increasingly framed these structures as temples in a more familiar sense. Ritual language grows more prominent. Hymns emphasize divine presence. The memory of administrative function fades as symbolic. Interpretation fills the gap. This is not deception, it is transformation as systems age. Their original purposes become harder to see. When records are lost or relocated, when procedures change, architecture remains. And architecture invites interpretation. The ziggurat, still towering over the city, still inaccessible, still elevated, begins to absorb new meanings. What was once restricted for functional reasons becomes restricted for symbolic ones. Elevation becomes holiness. Separation becomes sanctity. Memory reshapes structure. Yet traces of the earlier logic persist. Even in later periods, access remains limited. Even as ritual language expands, the upper levels do not become public. The priesthood continues to mediate. The crowd remains below. Something of the old system endures, even as its explanation changes. This pattern reflects a broader Sumerian understanding of history. The past is not erased by catastrophe. It is fragmented, preserved unevenly, reassembled through tradition rather than direct knowledge. The flood marks a boundary in the texts, but not a clean break. Kingship returns. Cities rise again. Systems are restored, though altered. What survives is not innovation, but memory. If the ziggurat was once a stabilizing mechanism, a place where order was preserved above the flux of the city, then its survival makes sense. Structures tied to memory outlast those tied to daily function. Houses are rebuilt differently. Markets shift location, but the elevated space remains by the time later generations look up at these structures. They inherit form without full context. They know the rules of access, but not always the reasons. They preserve the restriction, even as its original purpose becomes obscured.
This may be why the question of the ziggurat feels unresolved. It was never explained explicitly in the tablets because it did not need to be. It was part of a system understood by those who operated it. When that understanding faded, only the structure remained. What we are left with is not an answer, but an implication. If only priests could enter ziggurats, it may not have been because the space was holy in the way we expect. It may have been because it was functional in a way that required protection. A place where systems were maintained, records preserved, time regulated, and order stabilized. And once those systems were disrupted by flood, collapse, or distance in time, the structure endured, carrying forward a memory of restriction long after its original rationale had faded. Which leaves us with a final, quiet question. When we look at the ziggurat today, are we seeing a temple built for worship, or the architectural trace of a system designed to outlast those who once understood it?